All right, everyone. Federal court in Massachusetts weighs in on their draconian anti-Second Amendment laws, and a judge came forward to issue a statement. This is funny, saying, "Oh, Second Amendment doesn't explicitly guarantee the right to own an assault rifle, so you can ban assault rifles. It's perfectly constitutional." Let alone the fact that I believe that in a roundabout way, SCOTUS has basically defeated that argument and simply needs to take up such a case again. It's pretty clear which way they probably are going to lean in. Might even be a unanimous decision. I don't even think someone like Ginsburg thinks that such an arbitrary definition can hold up to constitutional scrutiny. But here's the funny part. The Second Amendment also doesn't explicitly guarantee your right to any particular firearm or weapon, or to bullets, or to peripheral things, or the differentiation. This was an argument that was made by anti-gunners in the sense of carrying weapons, in the sense of things like reciprocal or generally concealed or open carry. They said, well, Second Amendment says you can have guns. Okay, we grant that. You can have guns. But it doesn't say you can bring them off of your property. It doesn't say that you don't have to store them in a gun safe with a gun lock separate from the ammo, and we're going to randomly search your house to make sure that you conform to this. This is what, like, California wanted, and it got struck down largely. Largely, those kind of burdensome laws, or concepts of taxing firearms, which would keep them out of the hands reasonably of most citizens. You can imagine that the disarmament folks would love to levy like an enormous tax on firearms, which is literally what they've suggested. It is de facto disarmament if they were to succeed at that. It's like Dearborn there saying, well, you can't have an assault rifle, we're going to fine people. Okay, good luck enforcing that law. All of those assault rifles magically, oh, no, boating accident, okay. No, you can't fine me, prove that I have a weapon. So that's a problem. Number two, as soon as someone stands on principle and says, fuck you, and they come to their house to try to confiscate, and they say, well, I'm going to stand my ground here, so you better fucking back off, and then drags them before the Supreme Court, they will win. The gun owner will win. But yeah, we need to point out the logical contradictions, for there are many of them within the anti-Second Amendment folks' arguments. Case number one here, simply, the Second Amendment doesn't mention that you can't ban an assault rifle. It doesn't say anything about it. Well, yeah, the Founding Fathers didn't have a conception of so-called assault rifles. Although they did have, by the way, semi-automatic weapons. There actually was an air-powered musket at the time. Literally, you had canisters of compressed air. You could load it relatively quickly, and you literally would hook up the compressed air and you could keep firing. It was one of the first truly semi-automatic weapons. They had the puckle gun, which is like a primitive kind of, it's not really an automatic weapon, but sort of similar to it. It had a higher firing rate than a standard musket at the time. I would point out to you, to people who say, well, Second Amendment doesn't mean citizens should have military weapons, which is literally false. That's the point of the Second Amendment. The weapons that the British attempted to confiscate, the specific muskets and cannons and ball and powder sort of materials that they attempted to confiscate, which started the revolution in the first place, and this is specifically the reason why the Second Amendment was included in the first place. Those were specifically military-style armaments. The British didn't care if they had primitive weapons from 100 years before. These were the spit-shined new age of musketry that were more accurate, that were more powerful, that were better simply than weapons that had been in use for 100 years. The British had redesigned the concept of the musket, and they were military weapons. They didn't want the colonists having them because the colonists kept pouring hot water down tax collectors' mouths. They kept dumping the fucking tea in the rivers and in the ocean. They were doing bad things. They were setting fire to grain fields to prevent collection of that for the crown's revenue. They were in rebellion, basically. It was largely non-violent at the time. There was a lot of resistance. You had problems. So they didn't want them having stockpiles of munitions for private use. They said, if you keep your primitive flintlock you keep your very primitive pirate weapon in your own home, okay, that's not a problem, but you're storing them together, and these are the kinds that we're using, and we're afraid of you now because you're getting more numerous, and it takes us months to cross the ocean, so we're not going to deal with this shit, we're confiscating them. It's exactly, and the Second Amendment says nothing about the ability of an American citizen to own a musket. That's the thing, though. If someone could have made that same argument back then, said, well, yeah, the Second Amendment, prithee, the Second Amendment allows you to own a musket, but not that kind of musket. It allows you to, the first people, in the wake of the Revolutionary War, you do realize that they had privately owned, like, cannons and shit on their mercantile vessels. The Navy at the time was, hey, whatever vessels we can scrape together and retrofit a little bit. The Army at the time was, hey, a bunch of farmers and carpenters took up arms and drilled a little bit, and then we went off to fight, whoever we're fighting. That's what our military was at the time. You can't possibly make a constitutional argument that the Second Amendment doesn't cover military armaments. Here's the real thing. The free market fixes all. When people say, well, should you be able to own a tactical nuclear weapon? Yeah, you should be allowed to own one. The thing is, what individual is going to, number one, have the money to construct one, and number two, to maintain it, number three, to assemble it without killing themselves? None of them. It's a stretch for the average person wouldn't be able to afford even the most topical of an APC or something. A fairly lightly armored military vehicle, nor could they, by the way, afford the fuel for it. How the hell are they going to maintain it? Who knows? You can buy like a Bradley fighting vehicle or a decommissioned tank anytime you want. Did you know this, by the way? You can actually import, like in Eastern Europe, there are all sorts of late Soviet era tanks lying around. It doesn't even cost that much. The shipping costs more than the tank practically. All they have to do is drill through the gun bore, basically, and disable a few other systems. And yeah, you can get a fully working tank. It gets like, half a mile a gallon of diesel. So enjoy your gas guzzler. Yes, it'll definitely frighten your environmentalist hippie neighbors. You can own a tank. Yeah. You could build a little dirt mound and sort of put the tank in it in your front lawn and just like disable the rest, and it would just sort of be a turret or something if you wanted. Yeah, you could have a fortified turret. You'd have to remove the actual gun, and I don't know, you'd have to put on like some sort of other weapon onto it. But yeah, you could have an armored turret. Yeah, Soviet era, mid-'80s or something. And you can blast Duran Duran in there while you're busy, or whatever the Russian equivalent was. Of course you can. And it's been explicit, so obviously. No sane argument could be made against the owning of military-style weapons. And the AR-15, the big boogeyman of it all, isn't a military-style weapon. It is cosmetically similar to its military cousin that's actually got selective fire, that is actually automatic. Your civilian AR-15 is not fully automatic. The closest you're going to get to it is using a bump stock or a Gatling crank or something akin to that. And even it's not the same thing. And seriously, your accuracy would presumably suffer if you were to try to spray people down in such a manner. It would be asinine. Most people would never do so. A lot of people don't even want like a rifle at all. They have a handgun. Most gun crime in the country involves a handgun. It doesn't involve a long gun, a rifle of any kind. It doesn't involve anything like that. You're more likely to get stabbed to death than you are shot by a so-called assault rifle. So why don't we just listen to Sadiq Khan and say, get a life, bin the knife? It'd stop more crimes, supposedly. No, it's so dumb. And this judge doesn't know what he's talking about. The fact that there has to be a debate over this actually astounds me. It astounds me the number of people who don't understand what regulated meant in the mid-1700s. It astonishes me how many people know so little about history that they don't realize that when the Second Amendment was penned and codified, we did not have a military in the standardized sense. It was all volunteer. It was mustered on a needed basis by the people running the states. A governor could muster the militia, which was the private citizenry that happened to own weapons and be physically capable. Any male citizen who was old enough to vote and not too old so that he couldn't march. That was the militia. That's all it was. And mercantile vessels. The first military apparatus in the country was basically naval in nature. It had nothing to do with a standing on land army. Then you get the Marines coming in, the merchant Marines literally, to guard the Navy essentially, to be the army of the Navy. Didn't have a standing army at the time. What about the Air Corps? That doesn't even come. And the Army Air Corps exists, and then the Air Force, I think, was what, mid-40s, I think, before they even instituted a separate branch for it. Until then, it had been rolled up basically with the Army, with air power lent out to the Navy or to the Marines as well on a needed basis. So yeah, it's an interesting thing when people are trying to say, well, The Second Amendment defends a military that didn't exist when it was penned. In other words, it's impossible. It has to refer to a civilian militia that is mustered. They owned the private firearms. They owned the same kinds of firearms as any military up until the First World War. Up until the first Civil War, what were the soldiers using? They were using the same kinds of rifles and revolvers, bayonets, and everything else that a private citizen could reasonably manufacture on their own, or buy in any general store, or get under the table in any saloon. Absolutely. It wasn't until about the period of the late 1800s, First World War, the Navy gets an overhaul in the Teddy Roosevelt era. You have the Great White Navy and all of these things. Roaring 20s come through. You start having a switch towards different types of weapons that would be harder for an individual civilian to maintain. I think the litmus test should be this. Can an individual reasonably afford the in the absence of a tax or overt regulation, on its own, a fair market, assuming that, anyone with a regular business license can make the M or whatever, can a regular citizen reasonably use the weapon? Can an individual reasonably maintain and utilize it for the purposes of defending their nation should they be mustered? If shit were to hit the fan, we've got a nuclear war on our hands, federal government breaks down, the governor says, okay, able-bodied citizens, to the barricades because we're having to defend against 10 million Chinese people invading the coast or something. Everyone who can, you need to come with me and we're going to go and beat the shit out of them. Would the weapon that they're using be reasonably able to be carried around in a combat situation? Could they maintain it, essentially? That's the litmus test. That includes things, by the way, that includes a Browning, that includes a Tommy gun, that includes, by the way, those things are illegal. It's just you can't manufacture them. You have to have a very explicit license to show you're capable of using them without, I guess, destroying things around you, which makes some degree of sense. I think we should get rid of the manufacturing ban on automatic weapons. I think we should get rid of the import ban, all suppressor bans, all bans on types of magazines, scopes, suppressors, things of that nature. Now, I think people should be able to own all topical small arms. This, of course, doesn't mean explosives. You need more training to handle those without destroying. There's a reason people to be manufacturing like blasting powder or something. Yeah, probably not a great idea for the average Joe. He doesn't have a chem degree, doesn't really know what he's doing. He read the anarchist cookbook once and he's trying to make flash powder in his garage. What could possibly go wrong? Okay, that's a danger to society. Reasonable average citizen can't do that. The average citizen is incapable of making those materials and storing them safely. But the average person can field a so-called assault rifle. Average person can use a revolver. Average person can use, a topical handgun or even like a Tommy gun. It wouldn't take you very long to figure it out. Yeah, okay, you're not used to the kick of a fully automatic weapon. Okay, take it to the range. Put that in a different class. It's a Class B weapon. Okay, so you can go to a range and you can show us that you can fire it without hitting yourself in the head. Yeah, you can have your fully automatic Tommy gun. Okay, problem solved. Makes sense. We should have military weapons in civilian hands. Right now, we don't, largely. Right now, we have civilian weapons in civilian hands. The military has different weapons that are a lot more powerful. Now, of course, you can't do much about the fact that the U.S. military has, maybe an aircraft carrier, or like a private citizen. That's not even a weapon, it's just a ship. You could buy an aircraft carrier, yeah, you probably could. A private individual with enough money could commission one to be built, but, how are you going to sail it around, maintain it? You go in the wrong spot in the world, pirates will board that vessel, and they'll be more than happy to take it and scrap it and sell it off. Oh, that'll maintain them for 100 years. On their diet of half a bowl of chickpeas and some rice every other day. Yeah, it would be great for them. They could even afford some beef teriyaki from their Chinese counterparts that are building every factory in Somalia right now. So, yeah. No, I think that this judge is clearly wrong. Just as all of the anti-gunners, they're always wrong. Their arguments don't make sense. They could be so easily rebutted. How is it that there are people that still accept their stupid arguments? That's about all. Peace out.